Why does blackstrap molasses pull hogs to a feeder faster and hold them longer than sour corn on properties where the sour corn has stopped working? Because most people don't understand what they're smelling when they open that bottle, and neither did I until a cattle farmer in Wilcox County, Alabama, explained it to me while I was watching his hogs clean out a trough I thought was meant for his steers. I had been running sour corn setups on adjacent ground for 3 seasons and getting inconsistent results. He had been pouring a cup of blackstrap molasses into his cattle corn every week as a supplement, not as a hog attractant. And he couldn't keep hogs out of the pen. That was 11 years ago, and I have not found a single bait additive that outperforms molasses at the price point. Stick around to the end. A, because there's a modification that makes molasses work in cold weather when regular fermentation shuts down, which solves the single biggest limitation of any scent-based attractant during winter months, when hog pressure on crops actually peaks. Before we get into the chemistry and the setup, the regulations note matters here. Molasses as a hog bait additive is subject to baiting regulations in states where any wildlife baiting is restricted. The product itself is not banned anywhere. The activity of using it as bait for hogs is restricted in roughly 8 states where hog baiting falls under the same wildlife code as deer baiting. In Texas, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, South Carolina, and Mississippi on private land. You're clear. If you're hunting a state with ambiguous baiting law language, spend 10 minutes on your wildlife agency's website before you put anything out. The check takes less time than filling a feeder, and it protects everything else you've built on that property. The chemistry that makes blackstrap molasses specifically effective, not the light or medium grades, starts with what blackstrap actually is. When sugarcane is refined into table sugar, the refining process removes the sucrose crystals in 3 successive passes. Blackstrap is the liquid left after the 3rd pass. It contains roughly 45 to 55% sugar by weight, but it also carries the mineral concentration that was stripped from the white sugar, roughly 15 to 20% of your daily potassium in a single tablespoon. Significant iron, calcium, and magnesium in concentrations that don't exist in any other kitchen product at this price point. That mineral profile matters for hogs in a specific way. Wild hogs are mineral seekers. They root through soil specifically in areas with elevated mineral content. They wallow in certain mud holes preferentially over others because of the mineral composition of that soil. And they will return to a mineral lick the way deer return to a salt lick. When you mix blackstrap molasses into corn, you're not just adding sweetness, you're adding a mineral signal that hogs track from significantly further away than the corn scent alone carries. A cattle farmer who knows his land well can tell you which mud hole on his property the hogs prefer in summer. That mud hole is almost always the one with the highest clay mineral content. Molasses mimics the volatile organic signature of that mineral concentrated soil in a way that hogs investigate with a different behavioral response than they show to sweet attractants alone. They don't just eat it and leave. They root around the site, stay longer, and come back multiple times per night rather than clearing the corn and moving on. The science on the mineral-seeking behavior in hogs has been documented peripherally in research on feral hog diet composition, specifically from Texas A and M AgriLife Extension, work on invasive pig management from 2018, which noted that hogs show systematic preference for rooting in areas with elevated soil mineral concentrations. A wildlife biologist would explain this more precisely than I can. What I know is that the behavioral pattern the Wilcox County farmer described, hogs returning to that specific trough location over and over when cattle were being supplemented with molasses, matches exactly what the research describes. Hogs seeking mineral-dense food sources more persistently than they seek equivalent caloric sources without the mineral signature. That distinction is why molasses produces more sustained site loyalty than fruit ester attractants in my experience on my ground. The hog keeps coming back not just because it tasted good, but because the mineral signal reads as a resource worth revisiting. The secondary mechanism is fermentation rate. When you mix blackstrap molasses into corn at about 1 cup per 50 pounds, which is roughly the weight of a medium-sized dog, the sugar concentration of the mixture accelerates yeast activity dramatically compared to plain corn and water. And sour corn requires 3 to 7 days to reach its peak volatile output at moderate temperatures. A molasses corn mixture begins producing detectable fermentation volatiles within 12 to 18 hours under the same conditions. On a cold start setup, where you're trying to establish a sounder pattern before a hunt that's 4 days out. That timing difference is the difference between a productive setup and an expensive pile of corn that hasn't started working yet when you walk in. A guy on Arkansas Hunting detailed this timing difference in a side-by-side thread, comparing his standard sour corn setup against a molasses amended batch on the same property. He was using cell cameras on both and logged first arrival times. His plain sour corn setup got first sounder contact on night 5. His molasses corn got first contact on night 2. And different weather patterns across the two setups, different locations, so it's not a controlled study. But night 2 versus night 5 is meaningful when your hunting window is a weekend. The mixing ratio matters more than most guides I've seen online acknowledge, and the specific grade matters too. Light molasses is what most grocery stores carry, and it has been refined twice, meaning the mineral concentration is significantly lower than blackstrap. If you buy the wrong grade and run a comparison against commercial attractant and conclude that molasses underperformed, the grade is probably the variable that failed you, not the method. That is a mistake I made on my first attempt at this. All running the setup with a grocery store bottle of unsulfured light molasses because that was what I had and what the label said would work as a food additive. The camera results were mediocre. I thought the method was wrong. What was actually wrong was buying the wrong product. Blackstrap, third press. Feed store, not grocery store. Usually in the baking or supplement aisle, at a Tractor Supply or a farm co-op. Often sold in half-gallon jugs for cattle supplementation. That is the product that works. Light molasses, which is the stuff most grocery stores carry in the baking aisle next to the corn syrup, has been refined twice and has significantly lower mineral content than blackstrap. Blackstrap is the third press grade, darker and more bitter, usually found at feed stores or health food stores rather than general grocery stores. A 1-pound bottle runs somewhere between $2 and $4 at most farm supply stores. The application ratio on my setups is 1 cup of blackstrap per 50 pounds of corn, mixed wet before deployment. At that concentration, the corn absorbs the molasses rather than pooling under it, which means every kernel is carrying the mineral scent, rather than having it concentrated at the bottom of the pile, where it washes into the ground in the first rain. I actually burned a good setup in Bolivar County in the Delta Ag Country 2 seasons ago by pouring the molasses on top of an already deployed corn pile instead of mixing it in beforehand. We had rain that night. The molasses ran into the ground, and I had 2 weeks of camera data showing hogs working the area, but not committing to the exact location. Switch to pre-mix on every setup after that. You already know this pattern even if you have never run molasses. You set up a feeder on a new property, pour the corn, run a camera, and get photos every night for 2 weeks. Then you go in to hunt it, and the cameras go quiet for a week after. The bait is still there. The hogs are still on the property. The camera tells you that. They just stopped committing to the exact location during daylight. And your approach contaminated the site enough that their timing shifted. Molasses does not fix that problem. Nothing does except discipline about when and how you approach a setup. Yeah, but molasses gives you something that plain corn does not. A bait that holds hogs on the site long enough and comes back fast enough after pressure events that your productive window per location extends before education sets in. Here's something that took me longer than it should have to figure out. Molasses corn performs differently depending on how you cover it. Surface pours work for initial attraction, pulling hogs from distance, but they burn through fast because hogs eat surface bait quickly and move on. The whole method, burying the molasses corn mix about 12 to 14 inches down, which is roughly the depth from your wrist to your elbow if you measure along your forearm, produces dramatically different sounder behavior at the site. When hogs smell the molasses mineral scent coming through the soil layer, all their rooting instinct fires before they've even located the bait. They spend 15 to 30 minutes working the site before they get down to the corn, compared to 5 minutes on a surface pour. That extended on-site time is what gives you the shot opportunity you need. A sounder that cleans a surface pile and moves on in 8 minutes is a sounder you probably didn't get a shot at. A sounder that's actively rooting a buried hole for 20 minutes in front of your stand is a different situation. The depth also protects the bait from competing species better than a surface pour does. Raccoons will clean a surface pile, They're not going to root 14 inches to get to the corn. Hogs will, because rooting is their primary food-finding behavior, and the mineral scent coming through the soil is exactly what triggers it. Barn, if you're getting something useful out of this, hit subscribe. More of these coming. The regulation note I gave you at the start is worth revisiting for one specific context: hunting over molasses on properties that have active deer populations. In states where deer baiting is legal, this is a non-issue. In states where it isn't, molasses corn is subject to the same restriction as corn, which means the deer restriction applies even if your intent is hogs only. I've seen this get people in trouble in states that have recently tightened baiting law language to close loopholes. Don't assume that a product marketed for cattle or hog use exempts you from deer baiting restrictions in your state. The wildlife code in most states reads based on what the bait attracts, not what you intended it for. The cost accumulation on molasses versus commercial hog attractant powder is worth doing deliberately because the numbers are starker than most people expect. A commercial hog attractant powder from Bass Pro or Cabela's typically runs $12 to $18 for a 2-pound bag, and the recommended application rate consumes a bag every 2 to 3 setups. Over a 40-week hunting season, running 2 active setups, that's somewhere between $200 and $300 per year on attractant powder alone for 2 sites. A 1-pound bottle of blackstrap molasses at a feed store costs under $3 and covers roughly 10 to 15 setups at the cup per 50 pounds ratio I described. Full season, 2 setups, 40 weeks. You're under $15 total. The commercial powder is not 12 times more effective. Not even close. The mineral and fermentation chemistry in molasses is producing the same category of volatile that the commercial attractant companies are synthesizing in their products, just without the markup that pays for the camo-printed bag. I'm not saying the commercial products are worthless. I'm saying the comparison becomes very clear the moment you run both side by side and watch which one the hogs spend more time at on camera. One counter-argument I hear when I describe molasses setups to hunters who haven't tried it is that hogs that have been pressured over corn will avoid molasses too, because they associate food sites with danger. This is partially true, but it misses the mechanism. Pressure-educated hogs, the ones that avoid corn piles they've been shot over, all are specifically avoiding locations where they've experienced threats. A new location with molasses corn, set up fresh with no shooting history, doesn't have the threat association. The molasses signal is also different enough in its compound profile from plain corn that it doesn't immediately trigger the learned avoidance that corn smell does on a heavily pressured property. I've pulled sounders from properties in Pike County, Mississippi, where the corn feeders had been running dead for 8 weeks straight with 0 daylight activity. Same property, new location, molasses amended buried whole, first camera contact was on night 3. Right to be skeptical. You are right to be skeptical. Set up a camera and let it run for 2 weeks before you draw any conclusions. One thing I did not expect when I started running molasses across multiple properties is how differently it performs in different humidity environments. And the direction of that difference is counterintuitive if you've spent most of your time thinking about airborne scent throw. Most attractant discussion assumes that drier conditions with light wind are best, because the volatile compounds carry further horizontally. That holds for fruit ester and fermentation scent attractants, where the volatile compounds are primarily airborne. For molasses, the mineral component changes that calculation in wet terrain. Regional performance variation on molasses maps differently than it does for other attractants, and the pattern is almost the inverse of what you'd expect. In humid bottomland terrain like the Mississippi Delta and South Louisiana, where high ambient humidity keeps the fermentation volatile compounds close to the surface rather than projecting horizontally on the wind, molasses actually outperforms most other attractants because the mineral component travels through soil moisture rather than air. Hogs in wet terrain root more actively and track subsurface mineral signals more reliably than they track airborne scent. On my Glades County, Florida setup in Palmetto Flat Country, where the soil is sandy and dry and lateral scent throw is what matters, molasses performed about equal to my standard sour corn across a 6-week comparison period. In the Delta Row Crop Country in Bolivar County, where I run 2 setups in drainage ditch bottom, adjacent to a soybean field, Molasses outperforms sour corn consistently in wet conditions because the mineral signal survives rain events that shut down the fermentation chemistry entirely. That's the terrain where I run molasses year-round now and don't use anything else. There is one more limitation worth addressing before the modification, because it will come up in the comments and I would rather say it directly. Molasses works on hogs that are still willing to approach a food site. On a property that has had sustained shooting pressure over bait, the dominant sow may avoid any new food site for 3 to 4 weeks, regardless of what it smells like. Molasses is not a pressure reset. If your property has been hunted hard over corn for the last 2 months, and the hogs have gone fully nocturnal and started circling setups without committing, the fix is a 2 to 3 week rest, a new location at least 200 yards from any previous bait site, and a clean setup with minimal human scent. Start with molasses at that new site. It will get the pattern established faster than corn alone. But molasses cannot override behavioral conditioning that has been building for a full season. That is a different problem, and it takes time. The cold weather modification I promised at the start addresses the most common reason molasses corn setups underperform during winter months, when hunting pressure on ag properties is actually at its highest. At temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is cold enough that you're wearing an insulated layer under your jacket, yeast activity in fermenting corn drops significantly. Below 30 degrees, all roughly cold enough to see your breath clearly in the dark, fermentation essentially stops. No fermentation means no volatile output beyond the base mineral scent from the molasses itself. That mineral signal still works, but the scent throw drops to maybe a third of what you get in moderate temperatures, and the setup takes longer to produce results. The modification is pre-fermentation. Before you deploy the molasses corn in the field, mix it at home and let it sit in a covered bucket in a warm location, a garage, a shed, anywhere that maintains temperatures above 60 degrees Fahrenheit for 48 to 72 hours. At that temperature, and with the accelerated yeast activity that molasses produces, the mixture reaches its peak volatile output before it ever hits the field. When you deploy a pre-fermented molasses corn mix in 35-degree field conditions, you're deploying a bait that's already at maximum fermentation, rather than one that needs to catch up. The scent throw on the first evening is roughly equivalent to what you'd get from a week-old standard sour corn setup in ideal conditions. The fermentation slows to near zero once it hits the cold ground, but the volatiles that are already present in the mix continue to release for several days as temperature fluctuates. 2 things to know about this method before you try it. First, pre-fermented molasses corn smells significantly more aggressive than standard sour corn. My wife walked into the garage during the second pre-fermentation batch I ran and described it as a science fair project gone wrong. She was not inaccurate. And do this outside or in a detached structure if you value the continued goodwill of anyone who shares living space with you. Second, the mixture produces gas during fermentation and will pressurize a sealed container. Use a container with a loose-fitting lid or leave it slightly ajar. A tightly sealed 5-gallon bucket with a pre-fermenting molasses corn mix in it will eventually pop the lid on its own and deposit fermented corn across whatever you were storing next to it. That's a lesson I learned in a detached way, meaning I was not present when it happened, but the evidence was unambiguous. A thread on Texas boars from a hunter running properties in Drew County, Arkansas, documented this pre-fermentation approach across an entire December season and posted his arrival timing data from cell cameras. His pre-fermented setups in cold weather average first sounder contact on night 2. His standard same-season setups with non-fermented molasses corn in comparable cold conditions average first contact on night 7. Again, one property, one person's data, conditions he described, but I can't verify. But night 2 versus night 7 across a December hunting window changes how many productive sites you get out of a limited season. A detail on the pre-fermentation timing that I should have mentioned earlier. The 48 to 72 hour window I gave you is for temperatures above 60 degrees in the fermentation location. At 55 degrees, the window extends to roughly 72 to 96 hours before you hit peak volatile output. At temperatures below 50 degrees, even in a heated space, you are not getting meaningful fermentation, and the pre-fermentation method does not help. In that case, the mineral signal from the blackstrap is still present and still produces results, just on the slower cold weather timeline without the fermentation boost. You can compensate partially by doubling the molasses ratio to 2 cups per 50 pounds, which increases the mineral concentration of the mix and extends how far the signal carries without relying on fermentation. I tried this on a January setup in Bolivar County during a cold snap, where nighttime lows were in the mid-20s, roughly cold enough to freeze the surface of standing water in a cattle trough. The camera showed first contact on night 4 with the double ratio cold weather mix. I had nothing on the plain corn control setup in the same property that week. 1 week, one property, my cameras. Take it for what it is. The only limitation I'll close with is water. Molasses is water soluble, which means a heavy enough rain event, more than about an inch in 12 hours, will dilute and disperse a surface application significantly. In those conditions, a whole method setup survives the rain much better than a surface pour because the mineral compounds get driven into the soil layer rather than washed off the surface. If you're in a region where winter rains are heavy and frequent, the whole method isn't optional. It's what makes the difference between a setup that keeps working through a wet week and one that requires fresh bait after every rain event. The pre-fermentation method also has one social consequence worth knowing about. When you show up to a lease or a hunting camp with a bucket of pre-fermented molasses corn that has been sitting in a warm garage for 60 hours, the reaction from other hunters is consistent regardless of region or company. There is a moment of genuine concern, then someone asks what you are doing, then you explain, then they want to know the results. My experience is that the most skeptical person in the camp is usually the one asking for details 2 weeks later when the camera shows what came in. That is a reasonable sequence of events, and I have no objection to it. Set it up at the next opportunity. Pre-mix the molasses into the corn before you leave home. Use blackstrap, not light molasses. Bury it at 12 to 14 inches rather than surface pour, and give it 3 nights before you walk in. That's just if you have active hog movement on the property, the camera will tell you by night 2 or 3 under most conditions. If you get nothing by night 7, change location before you change bait. The location is almost always the variable that fails first, not the chemistry. The mineral and fermentation science in molasses is doing what it is supposed to do. Your job is to put it where hogs already have reason to be, and then stay out of the way long enough for it to work.